Hello. Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. You are at Florentine A for a breaking ground session. Next we have is Operation Escalation, how commodity programs are evolving and getting into advanced threat. We have our speaker, Israel Barak. Please put your hands together and welcome our speaker. Thank you. Barak.
Good afternoon, guys. My name is Israel. It kind of gives away my country of origin. You know, I come from Boston, and when I landed here in Vegas, I got out of the airplane. I felt the nice breeze outside. It kind of gave me a good feel of home. So you know, it's great to be here. Today we're going to talk a little bit about processes in which we see commodity malware or low-level threats that we are usually used to thinking of as untargeted convert very fast, actually, to highly targeted operations. And we're going to discuss a little bit the question of whether or not we should classify incidents or threats that we see into targeted versus untargeted as part of our incident response methodology. Specifically, we're going to talk about how black market trafficking of compromised enterprise computing resources actually affects our incident detection and response procedures, right? This phenomenon is actually what supports this rapid conversion of many so-called untargeted threats into targeted ones. And we'll drill down into that aspect of the industry as much as our time permits. So generally, when a new incident is detected, traditionally, before we were used to using the term targeted, typically, security executives, the CISO or the SOC manager, would try to estimate what the impact of the incident is on availability of services, on data, organizational data, and based on this, try to gauge the importance of the response to that incident. Now, at some point, generally, pretty much every piece of malware in the market, including click fraud and adware, kind of converted into something that is a full-blown remote access tool. And so the general question of what is the potential impact of the piece of malware that we're seeing here on the availability of services or potential data loss in the organization, the answer was, well, there's definitely a potential, right? The tool is capable of doing that. But that answer was not something that organizations could manage their prioritization processes with. And so people kind of tended to adopt the term targeted, right? And the question became, is this a targeted threat or an untargeted threat that we're seeing here? i.e. trying to gauge the level of probability that the attacker actually intends, right, to steal data off of the organization, cripple organizational capabilities, as opposed to something that a user kind of quote-unquote randomly caught as they were browsing the web or reading their email. But what we're going to see is, and we're going to talk about, is how commodity malware, right, can quickly transform into a very targeted operation, which can happen, well, based on some processes that we'll see here, between hours and days from the moment of infection. To address this topic, we would first talk about the black market machine trading industry. And we'll drill down into that and get a good feel for what a black market for machine trading is, how it works, the exact methods of operation, and what the targeted attacker can find in one of those platforms. We'll look at the processes for valuation. How do sellers evaluate machines? And as a result of that, what would be the characteristics of what they would do when they offer machines for sale? We would see what kind of tool sets these sort of marketplaces offer the sellers and buyers as they transact. And we'll talk about some of the tools, techniques, and practices that are common to this triangle of sellers, marketplaces, and buyers, right, as they transact. We'll review a specific case, a specific threat that we've analyzed from the attacked organization's perspective, in which the commodity malware's operator actually offered it for sale and went through the process of being sold to a targeted actor. And we'll see how that looks from the attacked organization's perspective. And we'll kind of summarize all that information, all the data, in a few maybe conclusions on how security operations centers can actually detect that these processes are taking place within their networks. A few words about my background. I originally started my career with cybersecurity in the Israeli Defense Forces. I headed the Israeli Defense Forces Red Team. I then went on to found a cybersecurity consulting group, which was kind of gave me a much more interesting perspective about both nation-state type threats and organized cybercrime groups. We incorporated that into Citigroup at a later stage, and I'm currently the Chief Information Security Officer of Cybereason. Let me, before we kind of progress, let me direct the question to you guys. Have you guys had a chance, any of you guys, to buy or sell compromised servers or endpoints online? Anyone? Let's go with buy. You know, it's the more, it's the less problematic position to be in. So no. Okay. So I'll devote a substantial amount of our conversation here to understand exactly how these marketplaces work and what you would see both as a buyer and as a seller when you transact with these marketplaces. One of, in my perspective, one of the most interesting marketplaces for the trading of compromised servers and endpoints today is called ecstatic. Have you heard the term, the word, the name? So one thing I would suggest before we drill down deeper into this, I would advise every security professional to get very acquainted with these platforms. Just like we're getting very acquainted with attack tools and pen testing platforms, going into these platforms and understanding how people put servers and endpoints for sale, and how does the tool set work, how does the process of transacting between buyer and a seller works. I think it's fundamental to the understanding of how attackers can get a direct line into the organization without going through phishing attacks, right, or watering hole, or malicious attachments. They can just get a server in the data center with 5 minutes of work. We'll see exactly how that works, but I would advise every one of you to, that takes interest in this, to try the platform. You can also see the URL there, ecstatic.biz. It's not even a Tor domain. It's right out there. Right? So the business has commoditized. People like Ecstatic have really commoditized the business of transacting on compromised enterprise resources. And we'll see exactly how much they've commoditized this market as we go in. So one note here before we go in, some terminology. compromised machines on these platforms are typically not referred to as machines. They're typically referred to as RDPs or SSHs. I'm selling and buying RDPs. Right? Typically, it's because these are the most common communication protocols that you would find with these machines, and we'll talk about the reasons for that. Okay. So let's look at what we have here at Exdetic. I don't know how well you can see, especially in the backlines there, but there's a legal notice here at the bottom. Can you see it? Right here. Resolution is not so great, but let me read it for you. It says, warning, if you're a company representative and want to check, you can really kind of hear the thick Russian accent there, and want to check your firm IPs for existence in our database, send email to provide your firm IP, et cetera, et cetera. So what the guys say basically, if you want to check if you're part of our database, just send us an email. What do you think, by the way, would happen if you sent them an email? Sorry? Of course you're part of the database, right? There are 15,000 US machines on that platform every day of the week. Of course you're in their database, by the way. But what else would happen? So let me tell you something. And I think it's something interesting, and you kind of get to learn this as you work with those guys. There's such a thing as honor between thieves, right? If they say something, they mean it, right? If they say that they're going to get you off their data set or off their database, they are going to get you off their database. But that doesn't mean that a second after you don't appear on one of their 12 other databases that appear under a different name and not Exdetic. That actually is exactly what's happening, right? So they will take you off, and they have this sort of creative interpretation of the legal reality of what would make them not be liable for these transactions. Anyway, just an anecdote. Let's try to register an account. Well, it says here, a warning to get the access in the shop. After registration, need to load $500, and only after this you'd be able to use the site. Whatever. So one of the things that you see here is they like to use tools like Jabber for communication. Typically, it's perceived as a relatively private or a relatively privacy-oriented tool. And here on the bottom, there's a reference part, right? As part of the registration process, the question is, how did you find us? Who recommends? It's kind of a remnant of the old days of compromised resource trading. In actuality, there are so many people involved in this operation, it doesn't take any effort, right, to find someone that fits this profile of someone who recommends you. It's pretty easily you can go in. And so we're in. So one of the things that we can do here is we can scroll through a list of compromised machines here and kind of pick and choose what we want to buy. On an average day worldwide, you'd find between 30 and 40,000 machines on this platform, on Exdetic. Similar number you would find on platforms like UAS, like Black Cash. So a couple of hundred machines. They're pretty unique, by the way, and they don't interchange, right? They don't contain the same machines on multiple platforms. They're pretty synchronized. So a few hundred 100,000 machines worldwide. On something like this, between 30 and 40,000 a day. But before obviously you can search for the platform of choice based on the type of provider that you're looking to gain access into, region, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe before we kind of sink our teeth into this, into the actual meat that we have here, that's the tool set that they offer, and the actual machines that are for sale, let's look at a few words of wisdom for this, from this marketplace operator. And the idea, again, is to figure out, understand the state of mind, understand the TTPs, the methods of operation. That will help us at the end to figure out how we can detect these processes happening in an enterprise environment. So let's look at a few words of wisdom. Code of conduct, right? There is such a thing even with a black market like this. Essentially, what you see here is a set of simple rules, but I think they basically define here the value proposition of why would you buy RDPs and why specifically would you buy RDPs from Ecstatic. I think it's interesting to see that last line here, just as an anecdote of stolen info from RDPs. Yes, many RDPs have a lot useful info about people and companies and can be sold at black markets at a big price. Again, a thick Russian accent there. You can kind of imagine the writer there. But that's the first part, right? A value proposition. So next thing, when people get RDPs, is using RDPs legal? All RDPs, what can be found in internet forums, is not legal, right? But what they're saying is, they give you this sort of tips, right? And they say, you must be careful with an RDP. Using main rules is, if possible, patch RDP. We'll look at those tools in a moment. These marketplaces, and Ecstatic specifically, offer a specific set of value-added, independently built tools to increase the value of transacting through them. We'll look at these tools. To patch RDP and create your own account at it, and et cetera, not really using your real IP when you connect to your bought RDPs. Another set of interesting words of wisdom here, basically saying we're not the owners of those RDPs. We don't know where they came from and who they are, right? And you'll see these translate into the search processes, right? When you search for specific targets, you don't necessarily search by name of the organization because they don't want to be perceived as knowing who this asset originally belonged to, right? Fair price trading, of course, you buy and sell at a fair price based on their understanding of what a fair price is. Interesting concept. They've actually introduced this concept into the market. You can become a reseller, right? So if you buy a set of RDPs and you don't need them anymore, you can go back to the platform and sell them. But obviously you can see here, but don't be so happy yet. Right? There are a bunch of caveats here. Caveat number 1, 80% commission. And there are a bunch of other ones, right? But it's actually a growing market. Reselling of purchase IDPs is a growing market, and Ecstatic is really pioneering that market. Okay. Next piece of code of conduct, and that's what I love about this, is really they've taken read the fucking manual procedure into really where it should be. Right? And you can see it in the middle. We checked your request. Typically, my credentials don't work or my IP doesn't work. I can't connect to the RDP that I bought. So, if we checked it and it turned out to be false, and user is stupid or too lazy to read this, right? By this, the FAQ, right? First strike. Warning. Second strike, we deduct money off of your account. Third strike, we take all the remaining balance in your account and you're out of here. So they've really taken the read the fucking manual into the appropriate level, right? Think what would happen if you try to implement this, this method in your organizations. Okay, last piece of the code of conduct, and that kind of gives us an idea on what you actually buy from the platform. What you actually buy is an IP address, a port number, a username, and a password. So that's what you buy. The seller is really responsible to set up whatever is required in the background for you as a buyer to connect to an RDP based on these connection parameters and be able to connect to your bot machines. And we'll talk about the implication of this as we model our detection strategy. Right? Because it's now that we've seen this, we can assume a lot on how the command and control infrastructure would look like, whether it's going to be tasking based or it's going to be a heavyweight protocol. And we'll talk about this a little later on in more details. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the tool sets that a platform like Ecstatic, by the way, the different platforms are pretty similar in the type of tools that they typically offer. So a platform like Ecstatic offers tools that would ease the transaction of buying an RDP and increase the value that the buyer can get out of a bought asset. So this tool specifically is a tool to convert a bought RDP into an anonymous proxy. A SOX service, basically wrapped up into a fairly straightforward UI. Next one is RDP log cleaner. So if you bought an RDP, you want to make sure that you cover your tracks after each session, then you get this nice tool here. But really the more interesting stuff are the next two tools. This tool actually helps you evaluate if the server or endpoint that you're about to buy was blacklisted by someone. Right? So you wouldn't want to buy an RDP that you wouldn't be able to use. And so they run it through fraud detection mechanism to see if anyone had actually blacklisted that IP, whether it is for spam or financial fraud or credit card related fraud or anything else. So obviously it's a paid service. Right? You pay per transaction. In this case, not a big deal, 25 cents. Another tool they offer is to make the most out of endpoint RDPs. The thing about RDP, obviously, with a Windows endpoint machine, is that you can't have concurrent connections of the same user. Right? So when you look at two users trying to log in as administrator, they would kick each other out. And so the question is, how do I buy an RDP into a Windows 10 machine? And when I connect as the administrator that I am, after all, I bought it, I don't connect the legitimate administrator, so they would notice that someone else is using that machine. And when they connect, they don't kick me out. And so these guys at Ecstatic, they built a patch for RDP. That's for the sellers typically to install. What it does, it basically patches the RDP service. So multiple connections of the same user can exist on that machine. And these are the type of tools that you would find in a large marketplace like Ecstatic. Any questions? Cool. Okay. So let's look at the actual server list, right, and see how that works. The first thing you do, the typical targeted attacker is kind of like a kid in a candy store here, right? A lot of targeted attackers don't necessarily come into that store looking for a specific organization, Organization X. Many of them come into that store because they look for intellectual property, or they look for credit card information, or they look for social security numbers, or they look for healthcare related information, or medical insurance information. And a variety of targets would fit their profile. They just need to see what opportunities exist here. And so they go into this platform and they start looking around. So if you start looking at, I want machines in specific organizations, I just put in US here, but you can find guys like T-Mobile US. You want a machine with T-Mobile? It's not a problem. That's on their list. Let's keep going. If you're interested in Verizon, it's also not a problem. If you're interested in a variety of banks, there's a long list here. When you look at, kind of filter all the machines that they have worldwide into US machines only. Well, about a week ago, this filtered to about 15,000 machines in the US. And it's a combination of servers and endpoints. Endpoints are about 15 to 20% of that. The rest are servers. A big mass of that would be on cloud providers, AWS, Azure, IBM, Rackspace. Other would be physical servers distributed all around the country. And again, you can check it out. I invite you to take a look at the list and see if you want to buy something. But let's look at specific examples and see how simple that is. We have here a machine actually being resold by someone for $30 in Washington, Seattle. University of Washington. If anyone's interested, it has an added value feature here, right? And you can see how they build the value, right? In this case, they tell you, listen, it's not only in the University of Washington, so if you're looking at stealing intellectual property, that's probably a good base for you to start in. We also tell you which software tools are deployed on this machine, which websites they visited, and you can probably find credentials cached on this machines for these websites. In this case, they tell you it's a point-of-sale machine in the University of Washington, maybe in the student registration office. So you can kind of enjoy all worlds, right? You can try to take this machine for intellectual property, right, and for data breach, or you can try to just steal credit cards off of that machine. And let's take a look at another example. In this case, a server from Phoenix sold for $14. EC Suite. Anyone know who these guys are? Credit card processing services. If you want to buy a server in their processing service, it's sold for $14 right now. So here's another one. Bristol, Virginia. Have you heard about this company? It's a server in their server farm, Microsoft Informatica. So if you're interested in intellectual property from those guys, if you're interested to potentially change their product and propagate malware into their customer base, it's right there for sale. How much was it? $14. That's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. For the targeted attacker, a platform like this is they just go in and they click buy, 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 buy. An attractive machine would disappear from this platform within 2 to 3 hours. And when we go back to the Security Operations Center organization that detected an incident of an adware running on one of their machines and deprioritized that incident to the bottom of the list to be taken care of maybe next week, and you consider the fact that if that machine exists in an interesting platform and the organization that operates this adware is sophisticated enough to have a server or machine reselling operation, and most of them do, especially the sophisticated ones, it's going to be sold for a much more targeted actor than that adware operator in less than 3 hours. And what that buyer is going to do is, it's a different question, and when they're going to decide to operate. Oregon, $13. Intel Corporation. Anyone interested in some of their intellectual property? Maybe modifying some of their security software? Why fish someone, right? When you can just buy 2008 R2 server in their data center in Oregon for $13. It's not even worth the minute you spend thinking about it. You just buy it. And the list goes on and on. It's an endless list, right? In this case, University of South Florida, Pennsylvania, if you're not interested in South Florida. What's that here? Washington, D.C., a Windows 10 machine sold by our dear seller, Mr. Obama here, for $850. That's a big number. That is a big number for a machine. This guy has a reason to believe this machine is extremely valuable. This platform is a very powerful social network. You can communicate directly with the sellers. You can book servers, reserve servers from sellers. You can have the first right of purchase from a specific seller if you believe that this guy is providing quality content, right, or quality access. So a person, or Mr. Obama here, would not price a machine, would not overprice a machine if they want to continue to be in that business. Again, it's the honor between thieves type thing. So Washington, D.C., an interesting machine, Windows 10, being serviced in this case by Comcast Business. Anyone said maybe a machine at the DNC? Good question. Maybe it's actually on the Trump side of the business. Any questions on what we've seen here before we move on? Yep.
How come the prices are in dollars and not Bitcoin?
Sorry?
How come the prices are in dollars and not Bitcoin?
You can pay in different currencies. You can pay in Bitcoins if you want. But the thing is, when you charge your account, everything gets converted to dollars. Whichever currency you pay, it gets converted to dollars in your wallet. And then you use whatever you have in your wallet to buy those resources.
What was the question?
The question was, why is the currency here dollars and not stuff like Bitcoin? Interestingly enough, these platforms adopt a lot of the e-commerce practices as it relates to identifying fraud. So if you'd want to use anonymous proxies to pay those guys, you would see that in most cases they would block you because they're concerned as anyone else that the money that they've given you or the credit that they've given you is going to be rejected by the credit company. So they actually take you through a lot of the traditional e-commerce payment method verification processes and the fraud analysis. Any other questions on what we see here? Okay. So a few statistics, right? Just to get a feel for what the numbers are. And you've already got a sense for what the numbers are. But let's talk about what aspects of the resource that's being sold impact the price. That would impact the actions that we would see the sellers doing as they prepare a machine for sale because they want to up the value as much as possible. So the most basic features that would up the price by approximately 50% on the commodity price, which is $5 to $10 per machine. Admin privileges, that saves a little time. Public IP, that means I can use that machine for setting up proxies, VPN gateways. I don't have to use specialized tunnels or C2 channels to get to it. I can use it from anywhere in the world. And network bandwidth. It has to be a significant amount of network bandwidth to actually impact that price. Next level, which would add between 50% and 1,000% to the sales price, is the type of software that's installed on the machine and the applications, or typically websites, that it accessed. Actually suggesting the type of usage, right? If it's a point of sale, there's something I can grab off of it. If I see access to multiple banking applications, there's something I can grab off of it, right? So these have a nice impact on the price. The jackpot, just like we've seen with our friend there, Mr. Obama, is enterprise affiliation. That would have a massive impact on the sales price. And that is why you would see crime organizations like the one that operate adware or click fraud tools devote a specific part of their operation just to go over the machines that they have under their control, figure out what is worth, what every one of them is worth, especially the enterprise-associated ones, and putting them out for a sale. Because in a typical click fraud, from a typical click fraud machine across its lifetime, you would make somewhere between $5 and $20 per machine. But if you can sell it here for $1,000 or $1,500, some machines are sold for $3, $5, $7, then it's a major difference in your revenue stream. So just kind of a last anecdote on the data that we've seen off of this platform. The top 5 states in the country that host compromised machines for sale. I'll give you the first 4, and I'll be happy to take guesses for the 5th. Number 1 is the state of California. 21% of the US-based machines offered for sale are actually based in California. New Jersey continues the list, New York, and Texas. Who would you say is the 5th state?
Nevada.
Sorry?
Nevada.
Nope. 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 It's going to be amazing. I found it amazing. No. Go figure. Go figure. But it is what it is. They have the exact same percentage as Texas and New York. So I don't know why that is. Yeah.
I actually live in Des Moines, Iowa, and Facebook and Microsoft opened up huge data sets. That's where it's coming from.
Well, there you go. I just thought it was kind of the stubborn approach to cybersecurity. Okay. How does that look like when this process is actually happening in an enterprise network from the attacked organization point of view? So we're going to talk a little bit about a set of incidents that we've seen that happened with a specific type of click fraud organization. So typically in an incident like this, and we've seen multiple cases of the same process driven by the same actor, we typically start with an untargeted, in this case it was an unknown fileless click fraud tool that affects several machines in the enterprise network. Typically the detection here was based on malicious use of PowerShell and malware communicating with known malicious C2 domains or IPs. Almost instantly, right, when you see this sort of characteristic, it gets deprioritized by a typical SOC, right? There are worse types of malware. There are more targeted operations. This is just a click fraud tool. You can see the communication pattern there. It communicates with a variety of ad platforms. It really goes to the bottom of the list. But then in the organizations that we've worked with on these cases, the SOC typically continued to monitor the compromised machines automatically, and they also in parallel blocked access to that known C2 address that they found the click fraud tool communicating with. But on average, about 5 days after that first infection, one of those machines, right? Typically the operational profile was take one and start with one of the sets, right? One of those machines stopped attempting to communicate with the known C2 and was detected performing domain generation to establish its next version of command and control, and after that, it communicated with an unknown C2 infrastructure. Now, the second upgrade that we saw here as the organization here, the operator here of the click fraud tool converted that machine and prepared it for a sale process, the second process was to change the profile of the C2 communication so it only occurred when the machine was apparently outside the corporate network. So if before that, the C2 communication would happen all the time, obviously get blocked by the organizational setting of blocking the C2 IP address. Now, communication only happened when the local IP address started with 192.168 or 10.0. Right? Typically, that happened when that mobile machine was out of the corporate network. And so the C2 communication went uninterrupted. And that is typically not something that you see from a broad, completely automated operation. That's typically something that you see as a result of a certain analysis that's done on the attacker's side on the machine that they're working on. Next stage would typically happen within the next 24 hours, during which the C2 communication profile started including downloading and uploading significantly more data from the compromised endpoint tool, and included escalated privileges to local system. If beforehand the click fraud tool didn't require those privileges, in this part of the operation, the tool escalated its privileges to local system. So if before we saw a communication profile that kind of matched the average click fraud in terms of web traffic, regular web traffic of hitting web pages and clicking buttons or links, afterwards we saw very significant bursts in the communication profile. And that could indicate, obviously, downloading of additional modules onto that endpoint, a heavier protocol than just a simple tasking protocol, or exfiltration of broader system information from the client side towards the attacker. Next step that we've identified on these machines is that the attack tool injected code and migrated itself into a specific process, in this case, MSDTC. We see here an example of one of these processes, after being migrated into, communicates with the new command and control infrastructure that was established by the DGA. One of the reasons, by the way, to migrate into a process like this is dumping credentials. Under certain platforms, you need to operate in the context of a built-in system service to be able to extract credentials out of that machine. That's, in many cases, the reason to migrate into a process like this. So let's try to summarize what we've seen into a set of let's call them rules or characteristics of how a seller marketplace buyer relationship would look like, right? And see how we can derive detection mechanisms based on that. So in terms of the command and control, most of these marketplaces would actually work with protocols like RDP and SSH for the command and control, or for the transactions that take place, the transfer control from the seller to the buyer. They're continuous. You typically don't risk losing access. They're very reliable. They're auto-verifiable, which is extremely important because the marketplace wants to make sure that the command and control channel works well before they transfer the ownership to the buyer, so the buyer would not go back to the marketplace and say, well, that doesn't work. I've tried it, it's not working. That way the marketplace can always say, I've tried that right before you, and it worked great. So a tasking-based C2 command and control, especially proprietary ones that are built by the attackers, are not necessarily a great fit for this type of offering, right? Even the attack the threat actors that have custom tasking C2 packages typically add RDP-based or SSH-based functionality prior to transacting on these machines to make the transaction a lot more smooth. Obviously, once the buyer goes in, the C2 communication profile changes to whatever the buyer wants it to be, unless they resell, and then it goes back. Privilege escalation. It's important to get to that first level of value. An admin access is worth more than an unprivileged account. So even if you don't require access for your adware, if you don't require admin access for your adware, if you want to put it up for sale, you want to maximize the value on it, you should probably escalate your privileges to local system. Enumeration of installed pieces of software and browsing history, so you can populate your value proposition on these marketplaces, saying how valuable this machine is something that you want to go through as a seller. So given these characteristics, we can put in place a few detection mechanisms that can help us surface, right, that these processes are taking place. Right? Obviously, as security operations can't prioritize everything, especially not threats that are perceived to be very low risk to start with, we want to have a mechanism in place that allows us to revisit a deprioritized incident and understand that what we've deprioritized a week ago is now something very different, or is going through a very different process, and we should probably reconsider its prioritization for remediation. So obviously changes in the command and control, right? Any changes from a known infrastructure to an unknown infrastructure is definitely an indicator, right? It means that it's worth more to the seller. Converting from straight IP to domain generation. Any connections that are to RDP service, especially on already compromised machines, right? And connections to RDP processes are not necessarily on port 3389, right? Connections to RDP processes are connections into the RDP process, regardless of the port on which they work, and regardless if they're coming in or if they're communicating with something that sent out that request. Changes in the RDP configuration, the modules that are loaded by RDP services. Changes in privileges, we talked about it. In identifying enumeration processes of browser history and installed pieces of software, right? As an indicator, again, on machines that we've already seen a malicious process running on. So we know that they have the potential of going through this process, and we now want to identify these indicators that would tell us that something is potentially going on. And something that was a little bit interesting kind of to us is we imagined that when a seller prepares a machine for sale, they would stop the thing that their use of that machine. So if they were using it for click fraud, they would stop that click fraud prior to transacting. Apparently, it's almost never the case. The seller continues their operation, and in many cases, buyers buy the asset when the previous operation is actually still in process. So the assumption of we're going to see a cessation of the previous behavior prior to that transaction is actually not a very good indicator. Any questions? Okay. So either it was very good or very bad. Either I was very clear or very unclear. What do you think? Yeah.
So you focused on Windows, obviously, but what about Macs? Is there a Mac marketplace, or how is that specific a platform marketed and sold?
Yeah. So the Mac marketplaces are actually a lot less common than the Windows marketplaces. The marketplaces like Ecstatic that have commoditized this market are almost solely based on Windows machines. There are smaller niche marketplaces for Linux machines, and sometimes you would find Macs, but they're pretty rare. I would imagine it's potentially a demand, perhaps, an issue of demand, but it's just what you see in the marketplace. Yeah.
From the point of view of a hacker, it would strike me that uptime would be an important aspect of a machine, especially given you can pivot or hide behind it. I didn't notice that on there. I may not have seen it, but I was wondering if that was a metric that was readily available.
Yep. So if you want, we can take a look at it afterwards on my machine, but on every listing on the marketplace has an indication of an uptime. Right, so you can get a clear understanding of how available this machine is. Yep.
So with the rise in the use of mobile technology, do you see a lot of, is there a Mac market for mobile? Is there one right now, Android versus iPhone?
So I think what we're seeing right now is first and foremost a strong transition into the endpoint. So traditionally these marketplaces would focus on servers. And in the past couple of years, you see an ever-growing percentage of endpoints. These would typically be Windows machines, but I think the reason, by the way, was that the traditional actors in these marketplaces were people that would do server scanning, IP scanning, right? They would find a server, right, and they would try to, brute force it and then list it for sale. And then new players came into this market, which are the commodity malware players, right? The adware players, the click fraud players, and their assets are mostly endpoints. But they've seen that they can transact on these endpoints and make, and monetize them significantly more than they do with regular click fraud. And that's why you see an increasing percentage of endpoints. I think given this situation, and the more we see these types of commodity malware going into mobile, the more mobile endpoints we'll see in these platforms. Sure. Any other questions?
Israel, we are out of time, so
Cool.
we have to stop it here. So,
Thank you.